In this video, I want to discuss what I've learned over the past 30 days of tracking my indoor air quality. In a previous video, I did a walkthrough of the Raspberry Pi based sensor I was using to track my indoor air quality, which was mostly driven by the environmental hat from Waveshare, which tracks temperature, pressure, and VOC index, as well as the plant tire particulate matter sensor, which measures the particulate matter at 1.0, 2.5, and 10 micron. So in this video, I want to review what that data looks like and the insights I've learned about my indoor air quality, as well as the pros and cons of this particular sensor setup and what I plan to do next with this data and the hardware. Be sure to check out the Raspberry Pi playlist if you want to see a walkthrough of the setup of this instrument and get a better description of all the components. Let's get started. So in this cell here, you can see a couple of major steps. One, I am drawing data from two different rooms, the office, which is the room I'm staying in now, and the main level, which is the room right above me. Importantly, I'm resampling the data every 10 minutes. So each sensor records every single minute. And in order to smooth out some of the noise of those measurements, I'm going to resample an average every 10 minutes and then apply any interpolation as needed. I'm also going to drop some of the columns I don't need, either because they're highly correlated with the existing columns or not that informative. I'm going to store those data frames as office and main level and then use them for the rest of the analysis. Here we have those 20 days worth of data, and we can see by and large the two rooms tend to move together. When one room gets brighter, as you can see by the Lux sensor, the other room gets brighter. But for the most part, the office gets significantly brighter, almost twice as bright as the main level. And as you can see, I have a wall of windows behind me, another window on this side of me, and another one right there. And so, of course, this room would get much brighter. So this particular insight wasn't that surprising. But if we look at some of the other sensors, we'll see some breakouts that are quite interesting, and we'll dive further into that later on in this video. The VOC index data here reveals that for the most part, the rooms tend to move very similar. The house I'm renting has a very open concept, and so most of the particulates that would impact the VOC just move throughout the house pretty freely, and they move even faster if we turn the air on. And so for the most part, we can see that these two rooms are highly correlated with each other, except for this moment here where the office has a spike in the VOC index that's not observed in the main level, which is in orange. We see another spike here, again in the office, where it is not reflected in the main level to the same extent. And then in a couple other cases where we have some changes that are not correlated. But as I said before, these rooms are quite similar. Something I noticed is that when we had spikes in the main level, the kitchen and the den, they tended to move throughout the entire house. But if I had a spike that was led by something that happened in the office, that was fairly isolated to just this space. What I can tell you about this moment here is I was cleaning up the office, which also doubles as our guest room, after we had a guest leave. And we can also see that when I opened the windows, there was a steep decrease on that same day, June 11th. And a significant increase in the humidity, likely due to either the window opening or my mopping the floor right next to the sensor that's behind me. And so we can see that there are some events that are happening that are impacting the VOC, the temperature, and the humidity of this room. Something else we can observe is that the particulate matter 1.0 and 2.5 are highly correlated. This correlation also extended to the 10.0 micron sensor data, so I also removed that from this data set. But I wanted to highlight this change here. As I mentioned before, these sensors are highly correlated. These rooms are highly correlated, likely due to the open layout. But we had a case where the office had a higher spike in signal than the main level, which is quite rare. When this occurred, I noticed that there was a burning rubber smell in the house, and there was a surface road behind here where there were folks doing burnouts and likely ruining their tires. And we can see that because the office level is lower to the ground, there was more of those particulate matters entering the house with the windows open. And we can see there's a high response to that external stimuli in the office, which is the ground level, versus the main level, which is elevated one floor above. Next, let's consider what this data looks like in the multivariate context. To view this data, we're going to perform PCA, and I'm just going to look at the office data that I'm showing here. So this is the office data where I've resampled to be hourly. And then we're going to compute the first three principal components, PC1, PC2, and PC3. And then I'm also just going to color by the humidity percent. Let's view that data. When we look at this, we have the scores plot on the left and the loadings plot on the right. The scores plot shows each sample, so these are each of those moments every hour over the course of the experiment. And the loading scatter plot shows the variables that are driving that separation that we observe in the scores. For instance, on June 10th and 11th, in the evening of the 10th into the early morning of the 11th, we can see that there was a spike in the humidity. I can tell that because of the co-location of these samples with this variable. Again, this is when I was cleaning up the office by mopping, vacuuming. I then eventually opened the window, but we can see how long that signal lingered in the space before the room returned back to normal. Also on June 3rd at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, this was the day the kids are home, and something happened near the sensor because we have a spike in the particulate matter of 1.0 and 2.5. This is also observed in the 10.0 channel as well. Notably, we are not showing the VOC values, and I'll talk more about that at the end of this video. Additionally, we see based on the loadings plot that the temperature and humidity tend to be on the opposite sides. This was visualized also in the line plots, where if the temperature spiked down, the humidity was often elevated. And we notice that again here where the humidity is decreased and the temperature is increased. So these tended to move in opposite directions, and we saw the most fluctuation when the air turned on. So if I was cooling the house, we see that the temperature decreased and the response from the humidity sensor would spike upwards. Furthermore, there is a trend that we can tell based on the lux sensor. The lux is an estimation of the human perception of light or brightness. And if we were to dig further into this, we'd likely see sort of a circadian rhythm almost of light response as a function of these different time points, where we would have our afternoon samples where the sun was the brightest, correlated to where this lux was elevated. And we have our evening samples when it was darker and the air was on, and lux would arguably be down as well. And so we can tell a lot of events here. One of the things I wish I would have done more is event tracking. I had the ability to use a Google Sheet where I could have annotated some of the events, but I'll save that for a future iteration. And lastly, I want to highlight some of the interesting phenomena with the VOC index value. So with the Waveshare environmental sensor hat, we're not getting raw VOC values. We're actually getting a VOC index. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, this VOC index is sort of an average of the past 24 hours. That would become our 100 point, the point that I read as 100. And then anything above that 100 would be an increase in the relative VOC concentration. And anything below that 100 would be a relative decrease, or we can almost say that this is an improvement in the air quality. And after running this experiment for 30 days, I noticed something interesting in my data, that the VOC data would spike pretty drastically and linger for quite a while before the air would have recovered or gone back down to baseline, especially if the windows were closed and the air was off. So even if the temperature was pretty comfortable, the air quality would be quite poor for quite a while. This included events like doing the girl's hair, cleaning, or cooking. And even when the air was on, sometimes we would see a circulation of those particulates from one room to another. And we can see that because we have sensors in multiple rooms collecting data in real time. So let me show you what this data looks like here. In the dashed orange line here, I'm actually showing the VOC index. So we had an event on June 22nd when I am beginning to clean the room. We had a bunch of visitors at our house and I was cleaning kind of late. If you can see, there's an increase in the VOC index as I'm using cleaning chemicals, washing dishes, vacuuming. And if we look at the derivative of that signal in the solid blue, there is a steep increase. However, the signal stops changing. We see that the derivative of the VOC signal goes down to about 0. And this is where we have a lingering of that elevated VOC. And then it really isn't until the next day when I open the windows that the VOC decreases. Notably, the air was on for the entire evening, and there is not a substantial decrease until the next day when the windows are open. Over the next day here, we don't have any major events, at least on the scale of these samples. And then once we have all the visitors gone, we do another big cleaning, and we have, again, another spike in the VOC signal. And more interestingly, it's really flat over the next several hours until the windows open and the air recovers. So this kind of data can help you understand the impact of a HEPA filter. Let's say instead of waiting on the windows to open or turning the air on, you actually just treat the air using a filter situation. And you'd expect maybe by estimating the integration of this area that we should see a decrease in those spiked regions because of the air treatment. So I learned a lot about my indoor air quality over the past 30 days of this multi-room monitoring experiment. And for the most part, these sensors performed really well. My biggest complaint was that the VOC values are not raw values, but instead an index value, which does limit my ability to apply them into a model without significant signal processing. That being said, I learned that the air takes quite a while to recover in my current home. So the benefit of having an open concept home and allowing things to flow also has the downside of spreading pretty bad air or diluting it over the entire home. And it isn't until I turn the air on or open the window that the air really recovers. And this includes events like doing my kids' hair, cleaning, or even cooking. So I can take this data and make informed decisions. I could even use this data and build a home assistant that gives me alerts for if I need to open the window or turn the air on. And I also want to consider using some sort of indoor filter, like a HEPA filter, to see if I can decrease the time it takes for my air to recover. Now, what would you use this sensor for? In any case, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.